We had the lawyers, the money, and the influence. Karen Blackstone, freshly elected as our HOA president, stood smugly beside her spotless white fence, watching with satisfaction as the demolition crew reduced my $1.8 million stone bridge to rubble. People thought I'd lost my mind when I swore I'd drown her entire $1 million farm complex in mud and water. But I didn't waste a moment. The drainage valve cranked open, and lake water surged out like a raging waterfall, engulfing her barns, storage sheds, and greenhouses. Tractors and expensive tools bobbed like wreckage from a shipwreck while Karen stood knee-deep in the mess, screaming in disbelief. I thought it was over until that night, when a knock at my door revealed police officers who weren't quite what they seemed. You'll understand soon enough who they really were. But before I get ahead of myself, I need to explain how it all began and how I ended up bringing down the most truthless HOA president in Millbrook County. The memory that started it all had been replaying in my mind for weeks. I was 8 years old, walking across that very bridge with my father on a crisp October morning much like this one. Halfway across, he stopped, placed his worn hand on my shoulder, and told me something I wouldn't fully grasp for nearly 4 decades. Son, this bridge isn't just for crossing. It's the heart of this land. Without it, nothing here survives. Now, at 45, standing in the ruins of my family's heritage, I finally understood his words. The bridge wasn't ordinary. It had been built in 1847 by my great-great-grandfather, officially listed as a historic landmark valued at $1.8 million, but its worth couldn't be captured in a number. Beneath its stone archway ran the original water channel that fed our entire property. For 5 generations, the Whitmore family had kept that bridge and its intricate waterways alive, sustaining our prized orchid greenhouse. Those 200 rare orchid varieties weren't just flowers, they were the backbone of our livelihood, earning around $80,000 a year from collectors and botanical gardens across the country. Then came Karen Blackstone. She moved in just a year and a half ago, buying the old Henderson farm at the end of Maple Ridge Drive. Within months, she'd maneuvered herself into the HOA presidency with promises of raising community standards and boosting property values. What she really wanted was control, and her first target was my bridge. The complaints arrived like clockwork, neatly typed whole letters claiming the bridge clashed with neighborhood aesthetics and posed a danger to residents. I tossed the first dozen in the trash. But Karen wasn't the kind to quit. The breaking point came 3 weeks ago. At an emergency home meeting she called at the community center. 15 neighbors sat in folding chairs, avoiding my eyes, while Karen stood at a makeshift podium, wielding her ever-present clipboard like a weapon. She had a full presentation prepared, complete with 3 sworn statements from neighbors claiming they'd seen dangerous cracks in the foundation. The vote was 15-3. Only Mrs. Patterson, the Johnsons from Oak Street, and I opposed her new emergency safety regulation, which required the immediate removal of any non-conforming structure deemed a risk to community welfare. The next morning, a legal notice landed on my doorstep: demolish the bridge within 7 days or face $500 in daily fines. I called Jim Morrison, the lawyer who'd handled my father's estate. After 2 days of research, he delivered mixed news. The bridge was indeed protected as a historical landmark, but state HOA laws were messy, especially when safety was involved. Marcus, he said, they can't just order you to tear it down, but they can bury you in fines and lawsuits until you give up. This could take years and cost more than the bridge is worth. I told him I needed time to think. Karen didn't give me that luxury. While I was in town buying orchid fertilizer, my 16-year-old son Tyler called in a panic. Dad, you need to get home now. There's a bulldozer here, and they say they have an emergency demolition order. I sped home, doing 70 in a 45. I was too late. Karen had called the local news, and Channel 7's Susan Mills was already filming as Karen told the cameras she was protecting the neighborhood from a dangerous hazard. The bulldozer's operator looked official in a hard hat, safety vest, and emergency demolition services painted on the side. Karen, in her immaculate white blazer, gestured at my bridge like it was a ticking time bomb. As HOA president, I have to put public safety before sentimentality. Mr. Whitmore has had plenty of time to address these concerns, and we simply cannot wait for tragedy to strike. From my truck, I watched 150 years of family history collapse under that blade. Every falling stone felt like losing my father all over again. This wasn't random, as someone had planned it down to the last detail, timed for when I'd be gone. With cameras ready to control the story, Tyler stood on the porch, tears streaming down his face, recording it all for the school project he'd been working on about local history. That bridge was supposed to be his centerpiece. By the time it was over, neighbors had gathered. Some looked uneasy, others avoided meeting my eyes. No one dared challenge the HOA president who had just demonstrated her full power. Karen gave one last interview, expressing regret but stressing her duty to community safety. Then she packed up her clipboard, climbed into her white BMW SUV, and drove away as if she'd just completed a routine inspection instead of erasing a piece of history. The real damage became obvious in the days that followed. Without the bridge's water channel system, my orchid greenhouse began to fail. These weren't store-bought blooms from a garden center, they were rare, temperamental specimens worth as much as $500 each, demanding precise humidity and irrigation to survive. By Thursday, a dozen were gone. By the weekend, the number had climbed to 47. Tyler worked tirelessly, cobbling together a makeshift watering system with hoses and sprinklers. But orchids are stubborn things if they don't take well to abrupt change. That Sunday evening, we sat on the porch, staring at the rubble where the bridge had once stood. My son, wise beyond his years, placed a hand on my shoulder just as my father had done decades earlier and said, "Dad, we can't let her get away with this. Grandpa built something beautiful, and she tore it down just because she could." I wanted to tell him that sometimes, bullies win, and good people have no choice but to move on, but the words stuck in my throat. My father's voice echoed in my head about protecting the land, and a thought began to form, and maybe Karen had made a critical mistake in her rush to show off her power. That night, I went to the old tool shed where Dad had kept his land surveys and engineering records. In the bottom drawer, beneath decades of tax receipts and maintenance logs, I found Ida, the original 1987 hydraulic survey he commissioned when modernizing our water system. Unfolding the yellowed paper across the kitchen table, I traced the delicate ink lines, and there it was, her blunder. Karen's Emerald Acres organic farm sat directly on what had once been seasonal floodplain. Worse for her, my father had installed a secondary drainage valve designed to divert excess lake water straight into the very low-lying area. As I studied the map, Tyler's tear-streaked face came back to me, along with my father's warning about safeguarding our land. My mind was made up. Karen Blackstone had picked the wrong family to cross. Still, I had no idea how far she would go or how ugly this fight would become before justice arrived. The next morning, I spread that 1987 map on the table like a general preparing for battle. My coffee went cold as I traced every waterway, flood zone, and drainage point. My pulse quickened the way it used to when I worked in engineering. Karen's prized farm wasn't just on low ground, it was smack in the middle of a natural flood bowl. Dad's own handwriting marked it clearly: seasonal wetlands. Avoid permanent structures. I grabbed my binoculars and climbed the ridge behind our property. From there, I had a clear view of her operation. What I saw made me smile. She'd poured serious money into this dream: 4 massive glass greenhouses, a computerized irrigation system, and neat rows of what looked like David Austin roses, likely worth hundreds per plant. The big red barn housed high-end farming gear, with at least 2 tractors visible. Then I spotted something interesting. Karen was giving a tour. 5 people in business suits trailed her, taking notes and photos as she gestured toward her facilities. I refocused my binoculars and saw an architectural model laid out on a folding table. Her sweeping motions toward the open fields told me this wasn't just casual, she was pitching investors. Curiosity got the better of me. I drove slowly past her gate, noting that she was too caught up in her presentation to notice. I parked at the public boat launch a quarter-mile away and walked back through the tree line until I was close enough to hear her voice. "Gentlemen, Emerald Acres will be Millbrook County's first truly sustainable agritourism destination," she said with the same commanding tone she'd used at the home meeting. "We're not just growing organic produce and heritage roses, we're creating an experience. Phase 2 will include a boutique bed and breakfast, a farm-to-table restaurant, and educational programs for city families looking to reconnect with nature. One of the investors, a tall man with silver hair, interrupted. "Miss Blackstone, the numbers look promising, but what about water rights and drainage? This land sits pretty low compared to the surrounding area." Karen's laugh was airy and dismissive. "That's not an issue. Our irrigation system is designed to work with the natural water table. And honestly, the previous owners never had flooding problems. The soil is perfect to excellent drainage, rich organic content." I nearly laughed out loud. She truly had no idea her farm sat in a natural flood zone. After the investors left in their sleek black cars, I stayed another hour, studying her layout. The greenhouses were built at the lowest point on her property, probably because the soil there was rich and flat. Her precious irrigation equipment was a broken bar. Her irrigation controls and storage tanks sat inside a concrete utility building positioned even lower than the greenhouse, right in the deepest pocket of seasonal wetlands my father had marked on his old survey. It was a permanent setup built by someone who never bothered to learn the land's history or check old flood records. The real turning point came when I located my father's emergency drainage valve. It was hidden behind a wild snarl of blackberry bushes and sumac, disguised as nothing more than a moss-covered block of concrete. I cut away 3 decades worth of overgrowth, and there it was, exactly where the survey map said it would be. The wheel was rusted but intact, connected to a 6-inch pipe running straight from our lake's overflow to the low valley where Karen had planted her empire. I remembered my father mentioning it once, back when I was in high school during a spring when the lake nearly breached its banks. "Son, that valve is for emergencies only," he had said while inspecting the other drainage channels. "Open it, and the valley floods like a dam just burst. Your great-grandfather built it in '32 to save the house and barn from a flood. Better to sacrifice an empty pasture than lose everything." Only now, that empty pasture was filled with Karen's greenhouses and barns. Standing with my hand on the wheel, I realized this wasn't about petty revenge, it was about justice. She had wiped out something irreplaceable, caused thousands in losses to my orchids, and done it with a smile for the cameras. She built on land she didn't understand, with money likely raised from investors who believed her curated vision of sustainable farming, never knowing the property's risks. The sensible, law-abiding part of me, my father's voice, urged me to take the high road, file the lawsuit, let the courts handle her destruction of historical property. But another voice, younger and more defiant, remembered running across that bridge as a boy. It reminded me that some bullies only understand the show of strength. Karen had destroyed my legacy in front of an audience. Maybe it was time to return the favor. That afternoon, I studied flood patterns and flow calculations in my father's old engineering manuals. The numbers told a clear story. If I opened the valve slowly, I could direct the flow exactly where I wanted. Her farm sat 6 feet lower than the outlet, and Dad's system could move thousands of gallons per minute, far more than her automated sprinklers could handle. At dinner, Tyler noticed my mind was elsewhere. "Dad, you've been staring at that map all day. What's so interesting about water pipes?" I looked at my son, the boy who had tried to save our orchids with nothing but a hose and determination, and said, "Remember when you told me we couldn't let her get away with it? Sometimes the only way to deal with a bully is to speak her language. She thinks she's untouchable, but she made one mistake: she built on the wrong land, and that's going to cost her." The next morning, I knew I had 2 options: the slow, expensive path through the courts, or a faster, more direct lesson in respecting nature's boundaries. The weather report tipped the scaly heavy thunderstorms expected overnight. Perfect cover. At 2 in the morning, with the rain hammering down, I grabbed my flashlight and headed to the valve. My hands trembled, and not from fear, but from the gravity of what I was about to do. My plan was simple: crack it open just enough to make a point. One full turn of the wheel changed that plan. 30 years of pent-up pressure erupted, not as a steady stream, but as a roaring wall of water. A torrent 3 feet wide tore down the slope toward Karen's property, sounding like a freight train colliding with Niagara Falls. Dad hadn't exaggerated. The thing was built for flash flood emergencies, and it was doing its job flawlessly. Within minutes, debris churned in the rushing brown water. I tried to shut the valve, but the pressure had locked it in place. This wasn't going to be a controlled warning, it was going to be catastrophic. The storm only added to the chaos, pouring more water into the system. By sunrise, I stood on my porch with a mug of coffee, binoculars in hand, watching the scene like a disaster film. Where Emerald Acres had stood 12 hours earlier was now a 3-acre lake, scattered with debris. By morning, the scene looked like something straight out of a disaster documentary. What had once been Emerald Acres' proud organic farm was now a 3-acre lake littered with debris, the surface resembling a floating graveyard. Karen's $180,000 John Deere tractor sat awkwardly tilted in 4 feet of muddy water, like a stranded green island in a sea of brown. Her state-of-the-art irrigation network, once the crown jewel of her investor presentation, was completely submerged, with only the top of the control shed visible above the flood line. The real ruin lay in the greenhouses. All 4 had been torn apart, a glass shattered, metal frames twisted into grotesque shapes like the remains of some ancient beast. 200 David Austin roses, each worth hundreds of dollars, were buried in a slurry of mud and plant debris. The expensive climate control systems, the precision irrigation, even the specially imported soil, all of it was now part of a stagnant, muddy wasteland stretching from her barn to the edge of her property. Around 7 in the morning, I spotted her white BMW racing down the driveway. Through my binoculars, I watched her step out in pristine designer rain boots, her face frozen in disbelief. She stopped at the water's edge, filming the devastation with her phone, her lips moving in rapid-fire commentary. Even from a distance, I could see the panic in her posture. Within the hour, she had called an emergency home meeting. Hardly anyone came. When I drove by the community center at 9, I counted 3 cars in the Lota, including hers. Through the window, I could see her pacing in front of a near-empty room, still in those ridiculous boots, waving her phone like it was a piece of evidence in court. The woman who once commanded a room full of intimidated neighbors was now talking to herself. From what Tyler overheard while riding past on his bike, she was convinced she'd been sabotaged. This wasn't natural flooding, she told the few who showed up. Someone caused this. She wasn't wrong, but she had no proof, no idea where the water had come from. As far as the neighborhood knew, it was just an unusually bad storm hitting a low-lying property. By afternoon, Karen had brought in a private investigator, Rick Solomon, a former cop with the demeanor of someone auditioning for a TV crime show. I watched him stroll around in dark sunglasses, taking photos, marking water lines, and studying debris trails. After 2 hours, he shook his head and muttered something that made her shoulders sag. Even a pro could see it looked like nothing more than an exceptionally severe but natural flood. Her investors, however, weren't as forgiving. The silver-haired man who had previously asked about drainage looked over the wreckage, pulled out his phone, and began making what I assumed were urgent calls to lawyers or insurance agents. By nightfall, all 5 potential investors had left, their luxury cars disappearing down the road, leaving Karen alone at the edge of her ruined business. That evening, Tyler and I made popcorn and sat on the porch, watching her crew struggle to pump water and salvage equipment. The thick mud made recovery nearly impossible. Her prized tractor was now a permanent fixture in the muck, a total loss. "Dad, that's the most expensive swamp I've ever seen," Tyler said, pointing toward the floodlights illuminating her fields. "Do you think she'll figure it out?" I thought of my father's careful engineering, decades of stored water finally finding its release, and the way life has a knack for delivering exactly the lesson someone needs. "Son," I said, "when you build your empire on someone else's foundation, you'd better be sure that foundation can hold." Tonight she learned you can't bulldoze through people's lives without paying the price. But as we sat there watching the wreckage, I had no idea that Karen wasn't the kind to accept defeat. The flooded farm was only the opening move in a much more dangerous game. What I'd thought of as the end was just the start. 3 days later, just as I was beginning to believe the trouble had passed, it came knocking literally. At 11:30 on Friday night, sharp raps at the front door pulled Tyler and me away from the baseball game. Through the peephole, I saw 3 men in what appeared to be police uniforms standing under the porch light, their expressions grave. Even before I opened the door, something about them felt wrong. "Mr. Whitmore, we're here about a report of property damage. We need to ask you a few questions," the tallest one said. It wasn't just their stanza, it was instinct. Years of volunteering with the county's emergency response had taught me how real officers carry themselves. These men didn't match the pattern. And then I noticed the boots caked in the same reddish clay that coated Karen's property after the flood. Millbrook County cops didn't patrol anywhere near the soil. Millbrook County officers usually stick to well-paved streets, not ankle-deep mud and farm fields. That was my first hint something was wrong. The second, their gear. Around here, every officer wears a body camera. It's been standard policy for 5 years, but these three didn't have a single one. Their radios hissed with static, missing the crisp digital chatter I remembered from working with emergency services. But the real giveaway came when I got a good look at their sidearms. The weapons were supposed to be Glock 22s with clearly marked serial numbers. Instead, the spaces where the numbers should have been were bare, smooth metal, like someone had either filed them off or bought fake props from a studio supply store. "We understand there's been flooding in the area," the second man said, his voice carrying a soft southern twang that didn't belong in our Midwestern neighborhood. "We're looking into reports of property damage. You'll need to come with us and answer a few questions about Tuesday night." I asked to inspect their badges more closely, and the tallest one bristled in a way no real cop would. "Sir, we're trying to conduct an investigation. Your cooperation would be best, but we can always handle this the hard way." That was all I needed to confirm they were frauds. Real officers here don't threaten people out of the gate, and they definitely don't turn up at 11:30 p.m. about a civil matter without a warrant. If this were official, they'd have called ahead or shown up during business hours, paperwork in hand. I told them I needed my jacket, stepped inside, and immediately texted Detective Ray Sullivan, an old family friend. "Ray, do you have any units at my place? 3 officers want to question me about property damage." His reply came in under a minute. "Negative. No units dispatched to your address. Don't go with them. Real backup on the way." While I waited, Tyler had been upstairs recording everything on his phone. Teenagers have a knack for that. Reviewing the footage later, we caught a gem. One of the men answered a call and said, "Karen, we got him. He'll sign the settlement by midnight, or we move to phase 2. That was the missing piece. I returned to the porch, calm but firm. "I'll be glad to help you with your questions," I said, "but I'm calling my lawyer first." That was when the tall man's patience cracked. "This is simple," he said. "You just admit you caused the flooding and work out a settlement with Ms. Blackstone. No need to drag lawyers into this." And there it was, the real reason for their visit. This wasn't law enforcement, it was coercion. Karen had hired muscle, dressed them in police uniforms, and sent them to my home to force me into paying for her losses. Then one of them made a fatal mistake. Adjusting his jacket, his shirt shifted just enough to reveal a logo beneath, Secure Max Private Security, in small blue letters. I recognized the name immediately. I'd seen their truck at Karen's farm during her investor events. That's when real sirens pierced the night. Detective Sullivan's cruiser rolled into my driveway, lights flashing. The look on the imposters' faces as they realized their bluff had just turned into felony charges was priceless. Impersonating an officer is a federal crime, and even Karen's best legal connections wouldn't make that vanish. The next morning, while Sullivan processed their arrests, Tyler burst into the kitchen with his laptop and headphones, pale as a sheet. "Dad, you need to hear this right now," he said. "I accidentally recorded Karen talking about chemicals, really bad stuff. 2 days after the flood, she'd been alone on her property, her voice carrying across the water. Tyler's sensitive new gear had picked it up from 200 yards away. No, her voice crackled through the speakers. The algicide shipment has to be destroyed. 20 containers, industrial strength. I've been using it for 6 months to keep the water perfect for investors. If anyone finds out I've been dumping it into the community system, I'm finished." I stared at my son, trying to wrap my head around it. Algicide, potent enough to kill algae in pools and decorative ponds, was in our water supply. Algicide is meant for swimming pools and ornamental ponds, not for streams and drinking water sources. It's lethal to aquatic life, harmful to plants, and can be a health risk to people if it seeps into municipal supplies. What Tyler's recording revealed wasn't just an illegal dumping scheme, it was proof that Karen had been contaminating our community's water for half a year. all to make her property's streams sparkle for investors. The pristine, bright blue flow through our creeks at the same water feeding the county reservoir had been chemically doctored. Tyler pulled up another file on his laptop, his voice tight. "Dad, remember when all those fish started dying in Miller's Creek back in February? And when Mrs. Patterson's once thriving garden suddenly shriveled up? I think we just found the reason." He was right. Over the last 6 months, there had been a string of environmental oddities everyone had chalked up to bad weather or climate change. Fish kills, dying creekside plants, even pets falling ill after drinking from outdoor bowls or streams. Now, it all made sense. I called Detective Sullivan immediately. His tone shifted the moment I explained. "Marcus, if this holds up, it's no longer a property dispute. We're talking environmental contamination. That's federal jurisdiction. If she's been dumping chemicals into the water supply, the EPA will be all over this. Hundreds of families could be affected." Within an hour, Sullivan was at my kitchen table, recording Tyler's audio evidence and taking our statements about the timeline of the strange environmental issues. And then we found the data that sealed it. My meticulously kept water records for the greenhouse operation. Since November, at the exact month Karen had started her so-called beautification project, the chlorine levels in our municipal water had jumped by 300%. Official notices from the water department had called it routine seasonal adjustment. But now the truth was obvious. The plant had detected contamination and had been over-chlorinating to mask it, without knowing the cause. Tyler and I spent the rest of the morning gathering every shred of evidence. We found 20 empty algicide drums hidden behind her flooded barn, likely intended to wash away or sink into the mud. Receipts from an industrial supplier showed steady monthly purchases of pond chemicals far beyond anything an actual organic farm would require. The most damning piece: water samples Tyler had collected for a school science project 3 weeks before the flood, still sealed in labeled jars in our fridge, proving contamination predated the disaster. By midday, Sullivan had contacted the Environmental Protection Agency. 2 hours later, agents in dark suits were on Karen's property, taking water samples, bagging evidence, and photographing every detail. EPA agent Sarah Martinez told us this kind of agricultural contamination was far more common than most people realized, especially in rural areas where people thought they could get away with dumping chemicals. "If she's been doing this for 6 months, Martinez said while snapping photos of the barrels, "we're looking at felony charges and massive cleanup costs." The timing could not have been worse for Karen. She was still reeling from the fallout of the fake police stunt when the EPA descended on her property. Through binoculars, I watched as they tagged every container, took readings from multiple sites, and documented a crude discharge system leading straight into the creek feeding our water supply. This wasn't negligence. This was intentional, calculated, and done to give her property the photogenic blue streams she thought would charm investors. Tyler, quiet most of the afternoon, finally spoke as the agents loaded the last evidence bags into their vehicles. "Dad, do you think she realizes that the fake cop thing is going to be the least of her problems now?" I looked at my son, the same kid who'd just stumbled onto a federal environmental crime with a school project, and felt proud. "Son, I think she's about to learn that when you build your success on other people's foundations, those foundations can crumble all at once." But I didn't yet realize Karen had one last, desperate move to make. Monday morning hit like a hurricane. Over the weekend, she'd hired a crisis management firm, and by sunrise, my phone was buzzing non-stop. This wasn't a defense, it was a counterattack. Her team had launched a coordinated, aggressive social media blitz to flip the narrative. The campaign, branded Save Our Community, portrayed her as the victim of so-called domestic eco-terrorism at the hands of an unstable neighbor. It was polished, relentless, and utterly fabricated. Suddenly, Facebook and Twitter were overflowing with posts from accounts claiming to be concerned Millbrook residents, all echoing the same talking points. By Monday morning, the smear campaign against me was in full swing. Social media accounts claiming to be longtime Millbrook residents were suddenly buzzing with posts about how I'd always been unstable and a menace to the neighborhood. Over the weekend, a professionally produced podcast titled The Truth About Marcus Whitmore had appeared. complete with interviews from anonymous sources painting me as a bitter man obsessed with revenge since Karen became HOA president. The host, calling herself a local environmental specialist, spent nearly an hour insisting that my supposed intentional flooding had stirred up decades-old toxins buried in the ground, causing all the contamination. But the biggest blow came in the form of a slickly edited video that exploded across every platform early Monday. It showed me standing near the old drainage valve after the flooding, apparently muttering about making her pay and teaching her a lesson. Tyler's voice and responses had been edited out entirely, leaving me looking like a man having a one-sided rant about vengeance. It was professional, persuasive and dangerously convincing. The caption read, "Local man admits to destroying neighbor's organic farm in revenge plot." This wasn't just a neighbor ranting online. It was a calculated PR assault put together by people who knew exactly how to weaponize social media. The podcast even featured an expert named Dr. Jennifer Walsh, who explained in scientific terms how man-made flooding could release hazardous materials. Facebook posts carried sleek graphics of water flow maps, contamination spread diagrams that looked official enough to sway anyone not scrutinizing the fine print. The damage was immediate. Tyler came home from school shaken after classmates asked if his father was an eco-terrorist. The guidance counselor even pulled him aside to quietly ask if things at home were safe. By midday, I'd received calls from concerned neighbors asking if there was any truth to what they'd heard. Mrs. Patterson, who had once brought us fresh vegetables, crossed the street rather than pass me on the sidewalk. Karen's smear machine was doing exactly what it was designed to, turning me from a wronged neighbor into a community outcast. That's when Maggie Chen, our retired judge neighbor, decided to step in. She'd been watching events unfold from her porch, and she knew exactly how destructive unchecked lies could be in a small town. At 3 p.m., she arrived at my door with a legal pad filled with notes and the kind of no-nonsense glare that had once sent defense attorneys scrambling. "Marcus," she said, "I've been digging into Karen's past, and the neighborhood needs to hear what I've found." Her research was meticulous. Using her access to legal databases, Maggie uncovered a sealed case from Orange County, California. Karen's 2014 conviction for environmental fraud. The crime? A near-identical scheme, contaminating a water source to make her real estate development appear more appealing to potential buyers. She'd paid a $200,000 fine, served 3 years probation, and then reinvented herself at dropping her full name, moving across the country, and burying her past. Armed with that bombshell, we decided to go public immediately. Tyler set up his camera gear by the ruins of the bridge. We called the same Channel 7 reporter who'd covered the original demolition, and we gathered every shred of evidence we'd collected. The timing couldn't have been better. EPA agent Sarah Martinez had just completed her preliminary water tests and was prepared to go on record. Our press conference was the opposite of Karen's polished PR blitz, raw, unvarnished, and backed by indisputable facts. Tyler played his audio recording of Karen admitting to dumping chemicals. I presented the EPA's contamination data. Maggie revealed Karen's hidden criminal record. The knockout blow came when reporter Susan Mills asked about the environmental risk, and Agent Martinez stepped up. "Our initial tests show contamination levels 4 times above EPA safety limits," she announced. "This is a serious public health threat." And then, Karen herself appeared hovering at the edge of the property. When Susan called out for comment, Karen shouted, "Those chemicals were FDA approved for agricultural use." Unknowingly admitting on camera to using substances explicitly banned near drinking water sources. It was over. By evening, Karen's social media offensive collapsed. The anonymous concerned residents' accounts vanished. The podcast was scrubbed from streaming platforms. The Facebook groups pushing her narrative went silent. Neighbors who'd been avoiding me started showing up at my door to apologize and offer help with rebuilding the bridge. Karen had spent months trying to control the neighborhood through fear and manipulation. Now, she was about to learn that federal judges aren't impressed by crisis management firms. As I watched her white BMW disappear down Maple Ridge Drive, I realized this was no longer just about me clearing my name. It was about showing what happens when ordinary people refuse to let bullies rewrite reality simply because they have money. Lawyers, and PR consultants. Karen had underestimated the strength of a community that decides to stand together. She was about to face the fallout from every falsehood she'd spun and every law she'd shattered in her relentless effort to ruin my family's name. 3 weeks later, I stood atop the rubble that had once been our bridge, watching federal marshals lead Karen Blackstone out of the Millbrook County Courthouse in handcuffs. The judge had just handed down her sentence: 18 months in federal prison, $150,000 in fines for environmental contamination, plus an additional 6 months for staging the fake police incident. As the marshal's vehicle disappeared down Main Street, a rare feeling settled over me: genuine peace. The shift in our community was nothing short of remarkable. In an emergency HOA vote that lasted less than 5 minutes, Maggie Chen was elected as the new president, replacing Karen without a single objection. Her first official act was to have my bridge recognized as a protected historical landmark and to establish a fund for its reconstruction. The EPA wrapped up their investigation shortly after, announcing a $2 million cleanup for our water system, most of it to be funded by the seizure and sale of Karen's assets. Tyler had become something of a local hero. The county newspaper ran a front-page story about the teenage journalist who cracked an environmental crime case wide open. CNN interviewed him about the role of young reporters in holding powerful people accountable. His school's journalism teacher nominated him for a state award, and 3 universities had already reached out with scholarship offers. Watching him face the press with confidence and clarity made me prouder than any bridge I'd ever built. Financially, the outcome far exceeded my expectations. Between insurance payouts, the EPA's victim compensation program, and our civil lawsuit, I received $500,000 to rebuild the bridge using its original 1847 design. The Historical Society even provided the archived blueprints. Construction would begin in the spring, updated for modern water flow yet faithful to its original appearance. Karen's downfall was relentless. Emerald Acres was seized and converted into a public wetland preserve. Her farm equipment was auctioned off to pay legal fees. Her white moi, the neighborhood symbol of her influence, was repossessed. Secure Max Private Security lost its operating license after the fake police incident, and 3 of its employees went to jail for impersonating officers. Her final humiliation came during an asset forfeiture hearing. Attempting to live stream a farewell speech, she accidentally admitted to more crimes, saying she had hired security consultants to pressure me. Federal prosecutors immediately added obstruction of justice to her record, extending her sentence by another 3 months. That evening, Tyler and I began sketching plans for a memorial to be built into the new bridge, a bronze plaque reading, "In memory of Daniel Whitmore, protector of these waters," accompanied by a time capsule. Inside, we'd placed Tyler's recordings, EPA reports, court documents, and newspaper articles so future generations would know how a small community stood up to corruption. Then, one day, a plain manila envelope appeared in our mailbox with no return address. Inside was an old photograph of my father standing on the bridge with an unfamiliar man, both pointing toward surveying equipment. On the back, written in neat handwriting, was a message: "Marcus, your father protected more than one bridge. There are 3 other locations in the county where guardians like him are needed now. The old drainage systems connect more than you realize, and some people would exploit them the same way Karen did. We need to talk." A friend Tyler and I spent that night studying the photo under a magnifying glass, trying to identify the second man and decipher the message. Whatever my father had been part of clearly extended beyond our property, and it seemed that protecting our water systems was a responsibility now passing to the next generation. Looking from the mysterious photo to Misa, the same young man who had exposed federal crimes armed with nothing but determination, I realized this wasn't the end of our story at all. Karen Blackstone had taught us that power without accountability is dangerous, but she'd also proved that ordinary people, armed with truth, can be stronger than any title, budget, or social media smear campaign.